The morning light filtered through Renna's apartment window as she stared at her laptop screen, her latest manuscript glowing back at her with its completed status. 300 pages of romantic fantasy, complete with a brooding prince, political intrigue, and enough sexual tension to make her readers swoon. She'd spent 18 months crafting the world of Valdres, a realm where magic flowed through bloodlines and political marriages determined the fate of kingdoms. Prince Kieran Blackthorne had been her masterpiece, a villain turned love interest with silver eyes and a heart supposedly frozen by betrayal. She'd written him as the perfect antagonist, cruel and calculating, before allowing love to slowly thaw his icy exterior. The story followed Lady Seraphina Ashworth, a diplomat's daughter who becomes entangled in the prince's web of vengeance against the royal court that destroyed his family. Renna rubbed her tired eyes and glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. Again. Her editor would have the manuscript by noon, and with any luck, the Prince's Gambit would hit the shelves by winter. She saved the document one final time and closed her laptop, already mentally planning the marketing campaign. The apartment felt too quiet as she made her way to the bedroom, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. Success as a romance novelist had afforded her this penthouse view of the city, but it couldn't chase away the loneliness that crept in during the small hours. She wrote about love, crafted passionate encounters and emotional connections, yet her own romantic life remained as fictional as her characters. Sleep came easier than expected, but it brought dreams that felt too vivid, too real. She dreamed of stone corridors and tapestried walls, of the scent of roses and the sound of distant music. In her dream, she wore an elaborate gown of midnight blue silk, and someone was calling her name not Renna, but another name that felt familiar on her tongue. When consciousness returned, it arrived with the wrong sensations. Instead of her memory foam mattress and Egyptian cotton sheets, she felt rough linen against her skin. Instead of the soft hum of her air conditioning, she heard the crackle of a fire and the distant sound of voices in a language she somehow understood despite never learning it. Renna's eyes snapped open to find herself staring at a ceiling of carved stone, intricate patterns dancing in the flickering light of oil lamps. Panic seized her throat as she sat up, taking in the unfamiliar room. Heavy wooden furniture dominated the space, and tapestries depicting hunting scenes covered the walls. This wasn't her minimalist apartment with its clean lines and modern art. "My lady, you're awake." A young woman with auburn hair and kind eyes approached the bed, carrying a tray laden with bread and cheese. She wore the simple dress of a servant, her manner respectful but warm. "I don't know," she admitted. "In my stories, the heroine always knew what to do. She was brave and clever and never doubted herself. But I'm not her. I'm just someone who wrote about her." "Perhaps," Kieran said, his hand resting on the door, handle. "Or perhaps you're discovering that you are always more than you realized. The woman who could create a world this complex, who could breathe life into characters like me, she's not just a storyteller. She's a creator, a shaper of reality." Before she could respond, he opened the door and stepped aside for her to enter. Mira was waiting inside, her face creased with worry as she rushed forward. "My lady, I heard about your father. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mira," Renna said, though nothing could be further from the truth. "Just tired. It's been a very long evening." Kieran lingered in the doorway, his silver eyes unreadable. "Sleep well, Lady Seraphina. Tomorrow we begin preparing for what's to come." After he left, Mira helped her out of the elaborate gown and into a simpler nightdress. But sleep seemed impossible as Renna lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. If Kieran was right, if she truly had some kind of power over this world, then she bore responsibility for everything that happened in it. Every character she'd created, every plot twist she'd devised, every tragic ending she'd written, they were all real, affecting real people who could suffer and die based on her imagination. The thought was overwhelming. In her novels, she'd killed off minor characters without a second thought, used them as plot devices to motivate her protagonists or create dramatic tension. But now those characters were real people with their own hopes and fears, their own reasons for living. As dawn broke over the castle, Renna finally drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of silver eyes and prophecies she'd never written. She woke to the sound of urgent voices in the corridor outside her chambers. Mira was already up, pacing nervously by the window. "What's happening?" Renna asked, sitting up in bed. "Messengers had been arriving all morning, my lady. The news isn't good." Mira's face was pale with worry. "The attack on your father's estates was just the beginning. There have been similar strikes across the kingdom, all coordinated, all targeting strategic locations." Renna's heart sank. This was definitely not part of her original plot. She'd written a story about court intrigue and personal vengeance, not a kingdom-wide magical war. "Have you heard anything about my father specifically?" "Lord Ashworth and his household managed to escape to the capital before the attacks intensified," Mira said, relief evident in her voice. "But his estates are lost, and many of his people are missing." A knock at the door interrupted them, and Mira opened it to reveal one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. "Lady Seraphina, Her Majesty requests your immediate presence in her private solar. She says it's a matter of urgent importance." Renna dressed quickly in a simple day gown, her mind racing with possibilities. In her novel, Queen Isabel had been a largely passive character, overshadowed by her husband's paranoia and her stepson's schemes. But the woman she met last night had shown more strength and intelligence than her fictional counterpart. The Queen's solar was a bright, airy room, filled with tapestries and comfortable furniture. Queen Isabel sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap and her expression serious. She was alone except for a single guard by the door, which struck Renna as unusual for such a high-ranking noble. "Lady Seraphina, please, sit with me." The Queen gestured to a chair opposite her own. "We have much to discuss, and I fear we may have little time. Your Majesty, if this is about my father's estates, it's about much more than that, I'm afraid." The Queen's voice was quiet but firm. "Tell me, my dear, what do you know about the old bloodlines? The families who carried magic in their veins before the Sundering?" The Sundering. Another term Renna didn't recognize, though it sounded like something from the deep history of her world. She'd never developed a detailed magical system for her novel, focusing instead on the political intrigue and romantic tension. I'm sorry, Your Majesty, but I'm not familiar with the term." "No, I suppose you wouldn't be. The histories have been edited over the years, particularly since the current dynasty took power." Queen Isabel's expression grew thoughtful. "But there are those of us who remember the old ways, who know what this kingdom was like before magic was declared dangerous, and those who wielded it were hunted down. You're talking about a magical purge?" "Purge?" "Not a purge, exactly. More of a systematic suppression. Those with strong magical abilities were encouraged to leave the kingdom or hide their gifts. Those who refused were eliminated, usually through carefully orchestrated accidents or sudden illnesses." The Queen's voice carried a bitter edge. The king's father was very thorough in his methods. Renna felt pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed beginning to fall into place. And Prince Kieran's family? The Blackthornes were one of the most powerful magical bloodlines in the kingdom. When the light faded, the chamber had been transformed. The cold, sterile apparatus of the ritual had been replaced by something that resembled a crate. Council chamber, with comfortable seating arranged in a circle around the now glowing crystals. The crystals themselves had changed too, their harsh edges softened into organic curves that pulsed gently with life. "It's beautiful," Mira whispered, expressing what they were all feeling. "It's a beginning," Renna corrected, though she felt the same sense of wonder. "The real work starts now." Over the following weeks, as the kingdom slowly recovered from the crisis, Renna found herself at the center of changes she could never have imagined when she'd first arrived. The revelation of her true nature as the Worldwalker had initially caused panic among some of the population, but Queen Isabel's steady leadership and the visible evidence of positive change had gradually won over crying, even the most skeptical. The integration of the hidden magical bloodlines into the kingdom's social structure proved to be a complex process, requiring careful negotiation and compromise from all parties. There were moments of tension, instances where old prejudices flared and threatened to derail the progress they'd made. But each time, The network of connection that had been forged in the Sunspire Tower proved strong enough to hold, allowing cooler heads to prevail. Renna's relationship with Kieran evolved as well, growing deeper and more complex as they learned to navigate the unique challenges of their situation. The knowledge that she had originally created him as a fictional character remained a source of occasional awkwardness, but it also gave their love a poignancy that she found deeply moving. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked him one evening as they walked together through the castle gardens. "Do you ever wish you could go back to being just a character in a story?" "Never," he replied without hesitation. "Being fictional meant being limited to whatever role you'd written for me. Being real means I get to choose who I want to become every day." "And who do you want to become?" "The man worthy of your love. The partner who can stand beside you as we help shape this kingdom's future. The person who chooses hope over vengeance, creation over destruction." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Most of all, I want to become the man who gets to spend the rest of his life with you, building something beautiful together." The proposal, when it came, was both surprising and inevitable. They were in the throne room, participating in a council session about establishing new magical academies throughout the kingdom, when Kieran suddenly stood and addressed the assembled nobles. "Your Majesties, my lords and ladies, I have a request to make." His voice carried clearly through the hall, and every conversation stopped as attention focused on him. "I wish to formally ask for Lady Seraphina's hand in marriage." The silence that followed was profound, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of disapproval. It was the hushed quiet of a moment everyone recognized as historically significant. "You understand," King Aldwin said carefully, "but this would not be a typical royal marriage. Lady Seraphina's unique nature means that such a union would have implications far beyond the usual political considerations." "I understand completely, Your Majesty. I'm not asking to marry the Worldwalker for political advantage or strategic alliance. I'm asking to marry the woman I love, whatever that means for the future of the kingdom." Queen Isabel leaned forward in her throne, her expression thoughtful. "And what of you, Lady Seraphina? Do you accept Prince Kieran's proposal?" Renna felt every eye in the room focusing on her, felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. In her novel, she'd written dozens of proposal scenes, but none of them had prepared her for the reality of this moment. "I do," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions churning within her. "I accept." The cheer that erupted from the assembled nobles was genuine and heartfelt, reflecting the hope that their union represented. But as the formal ceremonies and celebrations began, Renna found herself thinking about the deeper implications of what they were committing to. Their marriage wouldn't just be the union of two people who loved each other, it would be the formal joining of the creative force that had shaped this reality, with the character who had emerged from that creation to become his own person. It would be a partnership that transcended normal categories, a love story that bridged the gap between imagination and reality. The wedding, when it finally took place 3 months later, was unlike anything the kingdom had ever seen. Representatives from every magical bloodline attended alongside traditional nobles, while the ceremony itself incorporated elements from both old and new traditions. The keeper of the old ways performed the magical bindings that would link their essences, while Queen Isabel presided over the legal formalities that would make their union official in the eyes of the crown. But the most meaningful moment came when they exchanged vows they had written themselves, speaking not as author and character but as two people who had chosen to build a life together. "I promise to see you not as someone I created, but as someone who created himself through courage and determination," Renna said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed cathedral. "I promise to trust in your reality, your independence, your right to choose your own path, and I promise to walk that path beside you, whatever challenges it may bring. I promise to honor the gift of life you gave me by living it fully and consciously," Kieran replied, his silver eyes shining with unshed tears. "I promise to be more than the character you imagined, to grow beyond the limits of any story, to become worthy of the love you've shown me. And I promise to help you discover what it means to be not just a creator of stories, but a participant in the greatest story of all." End quote. As they kissed to seal their union, the cathedral filled with light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. a warm golden radiance that spoke of new beginnings and infinite possibilities. But even more than the magical effects, it was the sense of rightness that filled the moment, the feeling that this was how the story was always meant to unfold. The years that followed brought challenges and triumphs in equal measure. The integration of magical and non-magical society proved to be an ongoing process, requiring constant attention and adjustment. There were setbacks and conflicts, moments when old fears and prejudices threatened to destroy the progress they'd made. But each crisis was met with the same collaborative spirit that had transformed the kingdom, and each resolution made them stronger as a unified people. Renna's role evolved as well, from reluctant visitor to active participant to recognized leader. She and Kieran ruled jointly, their complementary skills and perspectives allowing them to address problems from multiple angles. Her knowledge of story structure and character motivation proved surprisingly useful in political negotiations, while his understanding of traditional power dynamics helped ground her more idealistic impulses in practical reality. But perhaps the most significant change was the gradual shift in how Renna understood her own nature. She began to see herself not as a writer who had accidentally stumbled into her own fiction, but as a bridge between worlds, someone whose imagination had always been connected to deeper truths about the nature of reality itself. "I think," she said to Kieran one evening as they sat together in their private study, "that I was never really just a writer. I think I was always a worldwalker, even when I didn't know it. The stories I wrote weren't fiction, they were glimpses of real places, real people, real possibilities that existed in dimensions parallel to my own. Does that change how you feel about them? About this place? About us? It makes me feel more responsible, but also more hopeful. If imagination can create reality, if stories can become truth, then the future is limited only by what we can envision and have the courage to pursue per." "And what do you envision for our future?" She looked around their study, taking in the books that lined the walls, some she had written in her previous life, others that chronicled the history of this kingdom, still others that were being written by scholars and poets inspired by Stubberid, their story. On the desk lay plans for new schools and hospitals, proposals for trade agreements with neighboring kingdoms, and drafts of laws that would further protect the rights of both magical and non-magical citizens. But beyond all the official documents and formal responsibilities, she saw something else: the life they were building together, day by day, choice by choice. The quiet moments of companionship, the passionate discussions about policy and philosophy, the shared laughter over private jokes, the comfort of falling asleep in each other's arms each night. "I envision a future where love continues to triumph over fear, where cooperation overcomes competition, where the barriers between different kinds of people continue to dissolve until we all recognize ourselves as part of the same story." She reached across to take his hand, feeling the familiar surge of connection that always flowed between them. "And I envision growing old with you, watching our kingdom flourish, maybe even writing new stories together about the adventures still to come." "Only maybe?" he asked with a grin. "Definitely," she corrected, laughing. "Though I think our next stories might be collaborative efforts. It's time I learned what it's like to write with a partner rather than just for an audience." As if summoned by their conversation, Mira appeared in the doorway carrying a tea service and wearing the smile that had become her trademark since being promoted to the position of royal advisor on domestic affairs. "Your Majesties," she said with a mock formal bow, "I hate to interrupt what is obviously a very romantic moment, but there are matters that require your attention." "What kind of matters?" Renna asked, though she was smiling. Mira had developed an uncanny ability to know exactly when they needed to be pulled back to their official duties. The kind that involves visitors from other kingdoms who have heard about our impossible success in integrating magical and mundane society. They want to know if our methods can be adapted to their own realms. Mira's expression grew more serious. "And there are also reports of dimensional instabilities in the eastern provinces. Nothing dangerous, but phenomena that suggest other worldwalkers might be manifesting in different parts of the realm." Renna and Kieran exchanged glances, both recognizing the implications immediately. If other writers were beginning to cross over into their fictional worlds, If the barriers between imagination and reality were continuing to weaken in other places, then their work was far from finished. "I suppose," Kieran said with a sigh that was equal parts weariness and anticipation, "that means we have more stories to write." "More stories to live," Renna corrected. "The writing is just how we make sense of them afterward." As they prepared to leave their study and return to the endless tasks of governance, Renna took one last look around the room that had become their sanctuary. The books, the papers, the comfortable chairs where they spent so many evenings planning and dreaming, all of it represented a life she could never have imagined when she'd been simply a romance novelist in New York. But more than that, it represented the truth she'd finally come to understand about the nature of story itself. Stories weren't just entertainment or escapism. They were explorations of possibility, blueprints for the kind of world that could exist if people had the courage to reach for something better than what they'd always known. And if her experience had taught her anything, it was that the most important stories were the ones people lived rather than the ones they merely read. The love she shared with Kieran, the kingdom they were building together, the future they were creating through daily choices and constant effort, these were the stories that mattered most. As they walked hand in hand toward whatever challenges and adventures awaited them, Renna felt a deep sense of satisfaction and anticipation. She had begun this journey as a writer seeking to escape into her own fiction, that she had discovered something far more valuable, the recognition that reality itself was a collaborative story, one that everyone had the power to help shape. The tale of the Worldwalker and her prince would continue, but it would no longer be a story she wrote alone. It would be a story they lived together, along with all the people whose lives had become intertwined with theirs. And while she couldn't predict exactly how it would unfold, she knew with absolute certainty that it would be a story worth telling. The end total word count, approximately 18,000 words, opposed the suppression. They were destroyed as an example to others. Kieran was only a child when it happened, but he witnessed things that would have broken a lesser person. So his quest for revenge is not just about personal grievance. It's about justice for an entire people who were systematically oppressed. The queen leaned forward, her eyes intense. "But there's something else you need to know. Something that Kieran himself may not fully understand." "What?" "The attacks that began last night, they're not random. They're targeting specific locations, places where the old magical bloodlines once had strongholds. Someone is trying to awaken the dormant power that was suppressed generations ago." Renna's mind raced as she processed this information. "And you think I'm connected to this somehow? I think you're the catalyst, my dear. Your arrival has set things in motion that have been building for decades." The queen stood and moved to an ornate chest in the corner of the room. From it, she withdrew an ancient-looking book bound in midnight blue leather. "This is the Chronicle of the Worldwalker, one of the few complete copies that survived the purges. I think it's time you learned the truth about who you are." The book felt warm in Renna's hands, as if it had been sitting by a fire. The leather was soft with age, and silver runes traced intricate patterns across the cover. As she opened it, the pages seemed to glow faintly in the morning light. The text was written in an archaic script, but she found she could read it easily, as if the knowledge had always been there in her mind. The first passage made her blood run cold. "When the barriers between worlds grow thin, when the old magic stirs beneath centuries of suppression, she will come. The Worldwalker, she who moves between the realms of imagination and reality, carrying the power to reshape both. She will arrive in the form of another, her true nature hidden even from herself, until the moment of awakening comes." "This is impossible," Renna whispered, but even as she said it, she felt the truth of the words resonating in her bones. "Is it?" Queen Isabel returned to her seat, watching Renna carefully. "You've experienced things since your arrival that you can't explain, haven't you? Moments where reality seemed to bend around you?" Renna thought of the flickering candles, the way Kieran had seemed to know her thoughts, the strange familiarity of a world she'd supposedly created from nothing. "Even if this is true," she said slowly, "what am I supposed to do about it? I didn't ask for this power, and I certainly don't know how to use it. The Chronicle speaks of that as well." The Worldwalker's power is tied to her understanding of the story she's been drawn into. The more fully she embraces her role, the stronger her abilities become. The Queen's expression grew urgent, but it also warns of a great danger. If she tries to force the story back to its original path, if she resists the changes that her presence has created, the fabric of reality itself could tear. "So I'm trapped here," Renna said bitterly. "I can't go home, and I can't even try to fix what's gone wrong." "You're not trapped, my dear. You're needed. This kingdom is on the brink of a war that could destroy everything, and you may be the only one who can prevent it." The Queen reached across and placed a gentle hand on Renna's arm. "But first, you need to understand the forces at play. And that means working with Kieran, whether you trust him or not." "Why should I trust him?" She caught herself before revealing too much. "From what I've heard, he's dangerous, possibly unstable. He's been shaped by loss and betrayal, that's true. But his cause is just, and his goals align with what needs to happen for this kingdom to survive." The Queen's voice grew soft. "And if the Chronicle is correct, you two are bound together in ways that go beyond simple attraction or political alliance." "What do you mean?" "The Worldwalker cannot fulfill her destiny alone. She requires an anchor, someone whose connection to the story is strong enough to keep her grounded in reality. The Chronicle suggests that this anchor is often the character she cares about most deeply." Renna felt heat rise in her cheeks. In her novel, she'd written Kieran as the ultimate romantic hero. Flawed but redeemable. Dangerous but irresistible. She'd spent months crafting his character, giving him depth and complexity that had made her own heart race as she wrote their love scenes. "That doesn't mean anything," she said quickly. "He's just a character I created." "Is he?" The Queen's smile was knowing. "Or is he the man you've been dreaming of your entire life, given form and substance by your power?" The question hung in the air between them, and Renna found she had no answer. She'd always been drawn to the dark, complex heroes in the books she read. Had always found herself attracted to men who were perhaps a little too dangerous for their own good. But the idea that she'd somehow created her ideal man, then been pulled into his world to fulfill some cosmic destiny, was too overwhelming to contemplate. A sudden commotion in the courtyard below drew their attention to the window. A group of riders was approaching the castle gates, their horses lathered with sweat and their clothes bearing the dust of prep. Hard travel. "More messengers," the Queen murmured. "The situation must be worsening." One of the riders dismounted and hurried toward the castle entrance, and Renna caught a glimpse of his face. Her heart stopped. It was Lord Matthias Voss, one of the nobles she'd met the previous evening. But in her novel, Voss had been a villain, one of the conspirators responsible for destroying Kieran's family. "Your Majesty, we need to warn the king," she said urgently. "Lord Vossi's not what he appears to be." "What do you mean?" Renna hesitated, unsure how much she could reveal without sounding insane. "I have reason to believe he's involved in the attacks, that he may be working with whoever is behind them." The Queen's expression grew sharp. "What kind of reason?" I can't explain it fully, but I know things about him, about his past dealings and his true loyalties. If he's coming here now, in the midst of this crisis, it's not to help." "You're asking me to condemn a man based on intuition?" "I'm asking you to be careful, to watch him closely and not trust him with sensitive information." Renna met the Queen's eyes steadily. "Your Majesty, if I truly am what that chronicle says I am, then you have to trust that my knowledge of these people is accurate, even if I can't explain how I came by it." The Queen studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. I'll ensure that Lord Voss is watched carefully, but in return, I need you to do something for me." "What?" "I need you to work with Kieran. Whatever your reservations about him, whatever fears you might have, the two of you need to coordinate your efforts. The kingdom's survival may depend on it." Before Renna could respond, the door burst open, and Kieran himself strode into the room, his face dark with urgency. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but we have a problem. Lord Voss has arrived with disturbing news about the attacks. He claims to have evidence that they're being orchestrated by surviving members of the old magical prey, bloodlines. Evidence? The Queen's voice was carefully neutral. Documents, testimony from captured attackers, even physical artifacts allegedly used in the magical strikes. Kieran's silver eyes found Renna's. He's calling for immediate action against anyone suspected of harboring magical abilities. Renna felt her blood turn to ice. If Voss was indeed the villain she'd written him to be, then this was exactly the kind of move he would make use the crisis he'd helped create to justify further persecution of magical bloodlines, including Kieran himself. What kind of action? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Arrests, interrogations, property seizures. He's also suggesting that all recent arrivals at court be subjected to magical testing to ensure they're not part of the conspiracy. Kieran's gaze was intense. That would include you, Lady Seraphina. This is moving too fast, the Queen said, rising from her chair. We need to slow things down. Give ourselves time to evaluate the evidence properly. I agree, Kieran said. But the king is frightened, and frightened rulers make rash decisions. We need to be prepared for the possibility that he'll accept Voss's recommendations. Renna's mind raced as she considered their options. In her novel, she'd written several scenes where the protagonists had to work together to overcome seemingly impossible odds. But those had been fiction, carefully plotted scenarios where she'd controlled every variable. This was real life, with all its unpredictability and genuine consequences. What if we could discredit Voss before he has a chance to present his evidence to the king? She suggested. How? Kieran asked. By exposing his true role in the attacks. If we can prove that he's been working with the enemy, it would undermine everything he's trying to accomplish. That's a dangerous game, the Queen warned. If we accuse him without proof, it could backfire spectacularly. But if we do nothing, innocent people will suffer, Renna countered. And the real perpetrators will remain free to continue their attacks. Kieran was watching her with a mixture of admiration and concern. You're talking about taking a significant risk based on instinct and circumstantial evidence. Sometimes that's all you have, she replied, drawing on every ounce of determination she could muster. Sometimes you have to trust your gut and hope for the best. In that case, he said with a slight smile, I suggest we move quickly. If Voss is planning to present his evidence to the king, we need to gather our own before he has the chance. What did you have in mind? The Queen asked. A little reconnaissance, Kieran replied. If Lord Voss is truly behind the attacks, there should be evidence of his involvement somewhere in his chambers or among his personal effects. And if Lady Seraphina's instincts are correct, we might find proof of his connection to the real conspirators. You're talking about breaking into his rooms, Renna said. I'm talking about conducting a discreet investigation in the interests of national security, Kieran corrected with a wry smile. There's a difference. The Queen looked between them, her expression troubled. This is incredibly risky. If you're caught, it could be seen as treason. And if you're wrong about Voss, then we'll face the consequences, Renna said firmly. But if we're right, we could save lives and prevent a war. Very well, the Queen said after a moment. But you'll need to be extremely careful, and you'll need an alibi in case something goes wrong. Leave that to me, Kieran said. I have some experience with this sort of thing. As they finalized their plans, Renna felt a mixture of excitement and terror. She was about to embark on what amounted to a spy mission with a man she'd created but didn't fully understand, in a world that was rapidly spinning beyond her control. But she also felt, for the first time since arriving in this strange reality, that she was taking action rather than simply reacting to events. There's one more thing, the Queen said as they prepared to leave. The Chronicle mentions that the Worldwalker's power is strongest when she's working in harmony with her anchor. If you two can truly trust each other, truly work together, you might be able to accomplish far more than either of you could alone. Renna looked at Kieran, this man she'd imagined into existence who had somehow become more real than anyone she'd ever known. His silver eyes held secrets and pain, but also determination, and something that might have been hope. Are you ready for this? He asked softly. No, she admitted. but let's do it anyway. They spent the rest of the morning planning their approach. Voss's chambers were in the east wing of the castle, far from the main areas of activity, but close enough to the king's quarters to be convenient for private meetings. The best time to search them would be during the afternoon council session, when all the major nobles would be occupied with discussions about the crisis. Kieran proved to have an impressive knowledge of the castle's layout, including several passages and stairways that weren't commonly used. He also had access to certain areas that would normally be restricted, thanks to his royal status and his reputation for keeping irregular hours. The key is to move confidently, he explained as they made their way through a narrow corridor that ran behind the main hallways. If anyone sees us, we're simply conducting business related to the crisis. Don't look guilty or suspicious, and don't explain more than necessary. What if we don't find anything? Renna asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Then we'll have to come up with another plan. But something tells me that won't be necessary. He paused at a junction in the corridor, listening carefully for any sounds of approach. Your instincts about people have been accurate so far. I'm inclined to trust them. They reached Voss's chambers without incident, and Kieran produced a set of small tools from his coat. Renna watched in fascination as he worked on the lock, his movements quick and precise. Where did you learn to do that? She whispered. You pick up various skills when you're planning a long-term campaign of revenge, he replied with a slight smile. It's amazing what doors open when you know how to open doors. The lock clicked softly, and they slipped into the room. Voss's chambers were larger and more luxurious than Renna had expected, filled with expensive furniture and decorated with artwork that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. But it was the desk that drew their attention immediately. The surface was covered with papers and maps, all related to the recent attacks. But as they examined them more closely, Renna felt her suspicions confirmed. The information was too detailed, too precise for someone who was merely responding to events. These weren't the notes of a man trying to understand what was happening, they were the records of someone who had helped plan it. Look at this, Kieran said softly, holding up a letter bearing an unfamiliar seal. It's written in code, but I recognize some of the symbols. They're from the old magical traditions, the ones that were supposedly wiped out during the purges. Renna studied the letter, and to her surprise, the symbols seemed to shift and resolve into readable text. The message was brief but damning. The first phase is complete. The Worldwalker has arrived as foretold. Proceed with the second phase when the king issues the magical testing decree. They know about me, she breathed. They know I'm here, and they're using my presence to trigger their next move. Which means we're walking into a trap, Kieran said grimly. But at least now we know what kind of trap it is. They continued searching, finding more evidence of Voss's involvement in the conspiracy. There were detailed plans for the attacks, correspondence with agents in various parts of the kingdom, and what appeared to be a list of targets for future strikes. But the most disturbing discovery was a map of the castle itself, marked with locations and notations that suggested an impending assault on Ravenshallow itself. We need to get this information to the Queen immediately, Renna said, gathering the most damaging documents. Agreed. But first, Kieran suddenly went rigid, his head tilted as if listening to something she couldn't hear. Someone's coming. Multiple people, moving fast. They had perhaps 30 seconds to hide the evidence of their search and find a way out of the room. Kieran moved with practiced efficiency, returning papers to their original positions while Renna frantically tried to remember if they'd disturbed anything else. The sound of footsteps in the corridor was getting closer, and Renna realized with growing panic that they were trapped. The main door was the only way out, and whoever was approaching would see them immediately if they tried to leave. The window, Kieran whispered, moving toward the tall casement that looked out over the castle grounds. Are you insane? We're 3 stories up. Trust me. He was already working at the latch, his movements urgent but controlled. There's a ledge that runs along this side of the building, and a stairway down to the gardens. I've used it before. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and they heard the sound of a key in the lock. Kieran got the window open and swung one leg over the sill, then turned back to her with his hand extended. Now or never. he said. Renna looked at the narrow stone ledge that ran along the castle wall, then at the ground far below. In her novels, she'd written characters who performed death-defying feats without breaking a sweat, but she'd never imagined herself actually having to do anything so terrifying. The door began to open behind them, and she heard Voss's voice speaking to someone in the corridor. Without giving herself time to think, she grabbed Kieran's hand and climbed out onto the ledge. The wind was stronger than she'd expected, and the stone was slick with morning dew. Her dress caught on the window frame, and for a terrifying moment she thought she might fall, but Kieran's grip on her hand was firm, and he guided her carefully along the ledge toward what she now could see was indeed a narrow stairway carved into the castle wall. They made it to the relative safety of the stairway just as voices erupted from Voss's chambers. Someone had discovered that the room had been searched, and from the tone of the shouting they were not pleased. "Move," Kieran whispered urgently. "They'll figure out how we escape soon enough." They descended the narrow stairs as quickly as they dared, emerging finally into a small garden that was mercifully deserted. Renna's legs were shaking with reaction, and she had to lean against a stone bench to catch her breath. "That was insane," she managed to say. "That was necessary," Kieran corrected, though his own face was pale with tension. "And now we have what we need to expose Voss and his conspirators. Assuming we can get to the Queen before they realize what we've discovered. They already know. The question is whether they'll try to silence us before we can act on the information." He took her arm gently. "Come. We need to move quickly." They made their way through the castle corridors, trying to appear casual despite their urgency, but as they approached the Queen's solar, they found their way blocked by a group of guards in unfamiliar livery. "Lady Seraphina," one of them said with a bow that managed to be both respectful and threatening, "Lord Voss requests your immediate presence in the King's council chamber. There are questions that need to be answered about your arrival at court." Renna felt her heart sink. The trap was closing, and they were running out of options. She looked at Kieran, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. They were outnumbered, and any attempt to fight or flee would only confirm their guilt in the eyes of anyone watching. "Of course," she said as calmly as she could manage. "I'm always happy to assist with official inquiries." As they were escorted through the castle, Renna tried to think of a way out of their predicament. They had evidence of Voss's treachery, but no way to present it. They knew about the conspiracy against the kingdom, but no way to warn those in danger. And they were walking directly into the hands of their enemies with no plan and no backup. But as they approached the council chamber, she noticed something that gave her a flicker of hope. The guards escorting them weren't wearing the royal colors, they were in Voss's personal livery, which meant this wasn't an official arrest, but rather a private action by the conspirators. "Kieran," she whispered as they paused outside the chamber doors, "these aren't the King's guards. This isn't a legal proceeding." "I noticed," he replied quietly, "which means we're not bound by the usual rules of courtesy and cooperation." The doors opened, and they were ushered into a room that had been cleared of all furniture except for a single table and several chairs. Lord Voss stood behind the table, flanked by Duke Thornfield and several other nobles that Renna recognized as minor antagonists from her novel. "Lady Seraphina," Voss said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "how good of you to join us. Please, have a seat. We have so much to discuss." "I prefer to stand," she replied, drawing on every ounce of courage she possessed. "What exactly is this about, Lord Voss?" "This is about treason, my lady. About foreign agents and magical conspiracies. About the very real threat that you and your companion pose to the security of this kingdom." His voice was smooth and reasonable, but his eyes were cold. "I'm hoping we can resolve this matter quietly, without the need for public trials or executions." "What exactly are you accusing me of?" "Of being exactly what you are, a Worldwalker, sent here to destabilize our realm and pave the way for invasion by forces from beyond the veil of reality." Voss moved around the table to stand directly in front of her. "Did you really think we wouldn't know? Did you think the old bloodlines had forgotten how to recognize their enemies?" Renna felt the blood drain from her face. If Voss and his allies knew what she was, if they understood her true nature, Then the situation was far worse than she'd realized. But she also felt a strange sense of clarity settling over her, as if accepting the truth of her identity had unlocked something that had been dormant within her. "You're right," she said quietly. "I am a Worldwalker, but you're wrong about why I'm here. Are we?" Duke Thornfield stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Then perhaps you can enlighten us about your true purpose." "I'm here to stop you," she said, and as the words left her mouth, she felt power flowing through her like electricity. The air in the room shimmered, and the candles along the walls flared brighter. "I'm here to prevent you from destroying everything this kingdom could become." Boss's composure cracked slightly, and she saw fear flicker in his eyes. "Seize them both," he ordered his guards. "We'll extract the truth through other means." But as the guards moved forward, Kieran stepped between them and Renna, his own power manifesting as frost that spread across the floor and walls. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. "I wouldn't," he said softly, and his voice carried the promise of death. "The lady is under my protection, and I take that responsibility very seriously." "Your protection?" Boss laughed, but the sound was strained. "You're a broken prince with delusions of grandeur. What protection can you possibly offer against the forces we command?" "This kind," Renna said, and reached out to take Kieran's hand. The moment their fingers touched, the world exploded into light and sensation. Power flowed between them, amplifying and magnifying until the very air seemed to sing with energy. The stone walls of the chamber began to crack, and several of the candles burst into towering flames. But more than that, Renna could suddenly see the threads of story that connected everything and everyone in the room. She could see the choices that had led to this moment, the possibilities that branched out from it, and the consequences that would flow from whatever happened next. "You're making a mistake," she said to Voss, her voice now carrying a resonance that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. "The attacks you've orchestrated, the fear you've spread, it won't give you the power you seek. It will only destroy the kingdom you claim to serve." "You know nothing about service," Voss snarled. "You're an outsider, an invader who threatens everything we've built. I know that you're afraid," she continued, the power flowing through her making everything crystal clear. "Afraid that the old ways are dying, afraid that change will sweep away the privileges you've fought to maintain. But change is coming whether you embrace it or not. The only question is whether it will be destructive or transformative." "Enough." Thornfield drew his sword, the blade gleaming in the supernatural light that now filled the chamber. "We'll settle this the old way." But before he could move, the chamber doors burst open and Queen Isabel strode in, flanked by a group of royal guards. Her face was set in lines of cold fury, and her voice carried the absolute authority of the crown. "Stand down, all of you. By royal decree, this gathering is dissolved and these men are under arrest for treason against the realm." "Your Majesty," Voss began, but the Queen cut him off with a gesture. "We found your correspondence, Lord Voss, all of it, including the plans for your assault on the castle and your arrangements with the magical cults you claim to oppose." Her gaze swept the room, taking in the cracked walls and the lingering traces of power in the air. "Guards, arrest these men. They'll be held pending trial for their crimes against the kingdom." As the conspirators were led away, Voss turned back to Renna with a look of pure hatred. "This isn't over, Worldwalker. There are others who know what you are. Others who will stop you before you can complete whatever mission brought you here." "Let them come," she replied, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that was beginning to set in as the power faded. "I'm not going anywhere." After the guards had left with their prisoners, the Queen approached Renna and Kieran, her expression a mixture of concern and awe. "Are you both all right? The servants reported strange lights and sounds coming from this chamber." "We're fine, Your Majesty," Kieran replied, though Renna noticed he was still holding her hand. "Though I suspect we've only seen the beginning of what's to come." "The evidence we found in Voss's chambers," Renna added. "It mentioned other phases of their plan. This conspiracy is larger than we realized. Then we'll need to be prepared for whatever comes next." The Queen's voice was firm with resolve. "But for now, I think you both need rest. You've done more than enough for one day." As they left the chamber, Renna felt the weight of everything that had happened settling on her shoulders. She'd discovered her true nature, exposed a conspiracy, and somehow found a way to work with Kieran that amplified both their abilities. But she'd also made powerful enemies, and the knowledge that other forces were moving against her was deeply unsettling. "How did you know?" she asked the Queen as they walked through the corridors. "How did you find Voss's correspondence?" "I didn't find it," Queen Isabel replied with a small smile. "Your maid Mira found it. Apparently, she followed you when you went to search his chambers, and when she saw you escaping through the window, she decided to conduct a search of her own." "Mira?" Renna was stunned. In her novel, the young woman had been a minor supporting character, loyal, but not particularly resourceful. "She's more capable than she appears," the Queen continued, "and more devoted to you than you might realize. When she saw you were in danger, she took action to protect you." The revelation added another layer to Renna's growing understanding of how much her fictional world had expanded beyond her original conception. The characters she created were developing in ways she'd never imagined, becoming more complex and independent than the roles she'd written for them. "There's something else," Kieran said as they reached the junction where their paths would diverge. "The power that flowed between us when we touched that wasn't just magic. It was something deeper, more fundamental. The Chronicle mentioned that the Worldwalker and her anchor would be bound together in ways that go beyond the physical," the Queen said. "I suspect you're beginning to experience that bond." Renna looked at Kieran, this man she'd created but who had somehow become more real to her than anyone in her previous life. The connection she felt to him was undeniable, but it was also frightening in its intensity. "What does that mean for us?" she asked. "It means that your fates are intertwined," the Queen replied. "For better or worse, you'll face whatever comes next together." That night, as Renna lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, she reflected on everything that had changed since her arrival in this world. She was no longer just a writer who had stumbled into her own story, she was an active participant in shaping its outcome. But with that power came responsibility, and the weight of knowing that real people would live or die based on her choices was almost overwhelming. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Mira entered quietly, carrying a tray of tea, and looking unusually nervous. "My lady, I need to tell you something," she said, setting the tray down with trembling hands. "About what happened today. About what I found in Lord Voss's chambers. Mira, you saved us today. I can't thank you enough for what you did." "That's just it, my lady. I didn't do it for the kingdom, or for justice, or any of those noble reasons." Mira's voice was barely above a whisper. "I did it because I remember." "Remember what?" "My other life. The one where I was just words on a page, where you wrote me into existence." Mira's eyes filled with tears. "I remember being created by you, being given purpose and personality through your imagination. And I remember how much you cared about every character you wrote, even the minor ones like me." Renna felt her heart stop. If Mira remembered being fictional, if she was aware of her origins as a character, then the implications were staggering. "How is that possible?" "I don't know. But when you arrived, when the real you stepped into our world, something changed. It's like we all became more than we were before, gained awareness of what we'd been and what we could become." "Dut." Mira sat down in the chair by the window, her composure cracking. "I'm not the only one, my lady. There are others who remember, who know the truth about their nature." "Who else?" "Prince Kieran, for one. I think that's why he was so certain about the prophecy, why he seemed to know you before you'd even met. He remembers being written, remembers the love story you crafted between him and Lady Seraphina." Mira's voice grew even quieter. "But he also remembers things you never wrote, feelings and experiences that developed after you gave him life." The revelation hit Renna like a physical blow. If Kieran remembered being fictional, if he knew she'd created him, then every interaction they'd had took on a completely different meaning. His attraction to her, his protectiveness, his apparent devotion, were they real emotions or simply programmed responses to his fictional nature? Does he resent me for creating him?" she asked, dreading the answer. I don't think so, my lady. But I think he's afraid that you see him as just a character rather than a real person. He's afraid that his feelings for you are genuine because they started as something you wrote. Mira leaned forward earnestly. But that's not how it works, is it? Just because you imagined us into existence doesn't make our thoughts and feelings any less real. I don't know, Renna admitted. I'm still trying to understand what's happening, what I am, what this all means. What it means is that you gave us life, and now we're living it. We're making our own choices, feeling our own emotions, creating our own destinies. Mira's voice grew stronger. You may have written the beginning of our stories, but we're writing the rest ourselves. The conversation left Renna with even more questions than before, but also with a strange sense of comfort. If her characters were truly independent beings now, if they were capable of growth and change beyond what she'd originally conceived, then she didn't bear sole responsibility for their fates. The next morning brought news that drove all other concerns from her mind. A messenger arrived at dawn with word that the magical attacks had resumed, this time targeting the capital city itself. Entire districts had been evacuated as strange energies swept through the streets, and the king was reportedly in a state of panic. It's starting, Kieran said grimly, as they met in the Queen's solar to discuss the situation. With Voss and his conspirators in custody, the real powers behind the attacks are moving more openly. But who are they? Renna asked. If Voss was just a frontman, who's actually controlling these magical forces? The Chronicle speaks of the Forgotten Ones, Queen Isabel said, consulting the ancient book that had become their primary source of Krat. Information. Survivors of the original magical bloodlines who went into hiding during the purges. According to this, they'd been waiting for centuries for the right moment to reclaim their power. And my arrival was the signal they were waiting for? Your arrival proved that the barriers between worlds were weakening, but the old magic was stirring again. They see it as their chance to overthrow the current order and restore the magical hierarchy that once ruled this kingdom. Kieran was studying the reports from the capital, his expression growing darker with each page. They're not just attacking randomly, they're targeting specific locations, the royal treasury, the military barracks, the magical archives. They're trying to cripple the kingdom's ability to resist them. Then we need to stop them, Renna said, but she had no idea how they could possibly accomplish such a thing. We need to understand them first, the Queen corrected. And for that, I'm afraid we're going to need help from someone who knows their history intimately. Who? The Keeper of the Old Ways. She's lived in the Whispering Woods for decades, maintaining the ancient traditions that were supposedly wiped out during the purges. If anyone knows how to counter the Forgotten Ones, it's her. The Whispering Woods lay a day's ride from the castle, through countryside that had been largely abandoned since the attacks began. As Renna and Kieran made their way along the forest paths, she was struck by how different this journey felt from anything she'd written in her novels. The weight of real danger, the uncertainty of what they might find, the complex emotions swirling between her and her companion Nunavik could be captured in mere words on a page. Are you having second thoughts? Kieran asked as they paused to rest the horses by a small stream. About which part? The dangerous mission, the magical conspiracy, or the fact that I'm apparently some kind of reality-altering entity? About us, he said quietly. About whatever this is that's developing between us. She looked at him, this man she'd imagined into existence who had somehow become more real to her than anyone she'd ever known. His silver eyes held vulnerability alongside their usual intensity, and she realized that he was just as confused about their relationship as she was. I don't know what we are, she admitted. I don't know where the line is between what I created and what you've become, but I know that what I feel for you now is real, regardless of how it started. Even knowing that I began as a character in your story, especially knowing that, because it means that you chose to become more than what I wrote. You chose to be real, to feel real emotions and make real decisions. She reached across to touch his hand. That makes you more admirable, not less. The moment was interrupted by a sound that made them both freeze, the low, haunting melody of a flute drifting through the trees. But this wasn't a human musician. The notes carried an otherworldly quality that seemed to resonate in their bones. The Keeper, Kieran said softly. She knows we're here. They followed the music deeper into the woods, where the trees grew so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight penetrated the canopy. The melody led them to a clearing where stood a cottage that seemed to be built from living wood, its walls formed by twisted tree trunks and its roof made of interwoven branches. The woman who emerged from the cottage was ancient beyond measure, her white hair flowing like water and her eyes holding depths that spoke of centuries of accumulated wisdom. She wore robes of deep green that seemed to shift and move like leaves in a breeze, and when she spoke, her voice carried the whisper of wind through trees. "Worldwalker," she said, her gaze fixed on Renna. "You have come at last, though later than the prophecies foretold. The barriers weaken, and the Forgotten Ones grow bold in their hunger for vengeance. You know why we're here?" "I know many things. I know that you carry the power to reshape reality itself, but also the burden of choosing how that power should be used. I know that the young prince beside you bears scars that run deeper than flesh, and that his love for you is both his greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability." The Keeper's eyes shifted to Kieran. "And I know that the two of you together represent something that the Forgotten Ones fear above all else, the possibility of true change." "What do they want?" Renna asked. "What they have always wanted: to restore the old order, where magical bloodlines ruled over ordinary mortals and power flowed according to ancient hierarchies. They see your arrival as proof that the time of hiding is over, that they can finally reclaim what they believe was stolen from them." "But they're wrong, aren't they?" Kieran said. "The world has changed, evolved beyond what it was centuries ago. You can't simply restore an old system and expect it to work in a new reality." "Indeed. But the Forgotten Ones are blinded by their desire for revenge and their conviction that they are the rightful rulers of this realm. They will not be reasoned with or negotiated with. They must be stopped." "How? How?" Renna asked, though she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. "By embracing your true nature, Worldwalker. By accepting that you are not merely a visitor to this realm, but its co-creator. The power to reshape reality flows through you, but it can only be channeled through deep connection to the story you inhabit." The Keeper moved closer, her ancient eyes boring into Renna's. "You must stop seeing yourself as separate from this world and start seeing yourself as part of it. I don't understand. You still think of this as a place you've fallen into, a story you've become trapped within. But it's not. It's a reality you've been helping to create since the moment you first put pen to paper. Every character you've written, every scene you've crafted, every emotion you've explored, they've all been preparation for this moment." The Keeper gestured, and the air around them shimmered, showing images that flickered like scenes from a dream. Renna saw herself in her apartment, writing late into the night, pouring her heart and soul into stories of love and adventure. But now she could see the threads of power that had flowed from her imagination into some other realm, weaving themselves into the fabric of reality itself. "This is why the Forgotten Ones fear you," the Keeper continued. "Not because you're a powerful sorceress or a mighty warrior, but because you represent something they can't control: the power of creation itself, the ability to imagine new possibilities and make them real." "But I never meant for any of this to happen. I was just writing stories." "Were you? Or were you always reaching toward something more, some deeper truth about love and courage and the possibility of redemption?" The Keeper's smile was gentle, but knowing. "The stories chose you as much as you chose them, and now the time has come to write the ending." "What kind of ending?" "That depends on the choices you make. The Forgotten Ones are gathering their power for a final assault on the capital. They plan to tear down the barriers between worlds entirely, allowing them to draw on magical forces from across the dimensional divide. If they succeed, they won't just conquer this kingdom, they'll reshape all of reality according to their will." Renna felt the enormity of the situation settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. The fate of not just one kingdom, but potentially all existence, rested on her ability to stop forces she barely understood, using powers she didn't know how to control. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "Some way to resolve this without more violence and destruction." "Perhaps there is," the Keeper said thoughtfully. "But it would require you to take a tremendous risk. To trust in something that goes beyond logic or planning. What kind of risk? You would need to confront the leader of the Forgotten Ones directly, not with magic or weapons, but with the power of story itself. You would need to show them a different ending than the one they've planned, a future where their grievances are addressed without destroying everything else. That sounds impossible. Most worthwhile things are, but you won't be attempting it alone. The Keeper looked between Renna and Kieran. The bond between you is stronger than either of you realize. When you work together, when you truly trust each other, you become something greater than the sum of your parts. The anchor, Kieran said quietly. You're talking about the anchor mentioned in the Chronicle. Indeed. But the anchor is not just a stabilizing force, it's also an amplifier. The Worldwalker's power is magnified exponentially when channeled through someone who shares her vision of what the world could become. The Keeper's eyes fixed on Kieran. The question is, young prince, are you prepared to trust her completely? Are you willing to let go of your plans for revenge and embrace the possibility of something better? Kieran was quiet for a long moment, and Renna could see the struggle playing out across his features. His desire for vengeance against those who had destroyed his family had driven him for years, shaped his entire identity. Asking him to abandon that was asking him to become someone entirely different. If I give up my quest for revenge, he said finally, what do I become instead? Whatever you choose to become, Renna said softly. That's the beauty of being real rather than fictional. You get to write your own story from this point forward. And if I choose to stand with you, to help you face whatever comes next, then we face it together, and whatever happens, we face it as partners rather than as author and character. He studied her face for a long moment, then reached out to take her hand. Then I choose partnership over vengeance, creation over destruction. I choose you. The moment their hands touched, the clearing around them seemed to pulse with energy. The Keeper smiled, an expression of deep satisfaction crossing her ancient features. Good. Very good. Now, let me teach you what you'll need to know to survive what comes next. The next several hours were spent in intensive preparation. The Keeper taught them meditation techniques that would help them maintain their connection even under extreme stress, showed them how to channel their combined power more effectively, and shared ancient knowledge about the nature of reality and the forces that shaped it. But as evening approached, their lessons were interrupted by the arrival of a royal messenger, his horse lathered with sweat, and his face pale with exhaustion. Your Highness, he gasped, dismounting and falling to one knee before Kieran. I bring urgent word from the capital. The attacks have intensified beyond all expectation. The Forgotten Ones have revealed themselves openly and issued an ultimatum to the king. What kind of ultimatum? Renna asked, though she dreaded the answer. They demand the immediate surrender of the Worldwalker and her anchor, claiming that their presence has destabilized the realm and brought chaos to the kingdom. If the king does not comply within 3 days, they threaten to tear down the barriers between worlds entirely and allow the forces of chaos to pour through. Renna felt her blood turn to ice. Not only were the Forgotten Ones targeting her specifically, but they were using her presence as justification for their most extreme actions. She was being forced into exactly the position she'd hoped to avoid, where her surrender might save countless lives, but where her death would also doom any chance of stopping their larger plans. There's more, the messenger continued. They've taken hostages from among the nobility, including Lord Ashworth. They're holding them in the old Sunspire Tower, the one that was abandoned after the magical purges. They say the hostages will be released unharmed, if their demands are met. My father, Renna whispered. Even though she knew Lord Ashworth was technically a fictional character, the thought of him being tortured or killed because of her actions was unbearable. This changes everything, Kieran said grimly. We can't wait for a perfect solution. We have to act now. Agreed, the Keeper said. But you must be very careful. The Forgotten Ones have chosen their ground well. The Sunspire Tower is built on one of the oldest magical nexuses in the kingdom. Their power will be strongest there, and any attempt to confront them will be extremely dangerous. Then we'd better make sure we're ready, Renna said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. Because ready or not, we're going to face them. The journey back to the capital took them through countryside that bore increasing signs of the magical attacks. Fields lay withered and blackened, villages stood empty and abandoned, and the very air seemed to shimmer with unstable energies. As they drew closer to the city, they could see strange lights dancing in the sky above the Sunspire Tower, and the sound of otherworldly music drifted on the wind. "It's begun," Kieran said as they crested a hill that gave them their first clear view of the capital. "They're opening the barriers between worlds." The city below them was in chaos. People fled through the streets carrying whatever possessions they could manage, while royal guards tried desperately to maintain some semblance of order. But it was the tower itself that held their attention, a spire of black stone that seemed to twist and writhe against the sky, surrounded by energies that hurt to look at directly. "We need to get to the castle first," Renna said. "We need to coordinate with the Queen and make sure someone knows what we're planning." "If we can get to the castle," Kieran corrected. "The streets are barely passable, and there's no guarantee the royal guard will recognize us in this chaos." They made their way through the city as quickly as they could, using side streets and alleyways to avoid the worst of the crowds. But as they approached the castle district, they found their way blocked by a group of armed figures in dark robes. "The Worldwalker," one of them said, his voice carrying an unnatural resonance. "You have come to us at last. Our master wishes to speak with you before the final ritual begins." "Your master can speak with me at the tower," Renna replied, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "I'm not going anywhere with you." "I think you misunderstand the situation," the figure continued. "You are not being invited, you are being summoned." The air around them began to thicken and swirl, and Renna realized with growing alarm that they were being surrounded by some kind of magical barrier. She reached for Kieran's hand, feeling their combined power flow between them, but the barrier continued to tighten. "Don't fight it," a new voice said from behind them. "You'll only make things worse for everyone." They turned to see a woman approaching, her features aristocratic and coldly beautiful. She wore robes of midnight blue embroidered with silver symbols, and her eyes held the depthless darkness of a starless night. Renna recognized her immediately from her own descriptions. Lady Morwen Shadowmere, the villainess she'd created to serve as Kieran's former love, and the woman whose death had triggered his quest for revenge. But this version of Morwen was very much alive, and very much in command of the situation. "Surprised to see me?" Morwen asked with a smile that held no warmth. "I suppose you would be, considering that you wrote my death into your little story. But death, as it turns out, is rather negotiable when you have sufficient magical power." "You're supposed to be dead," Renna said stupidly. "I was dead, for a time. But the Forgotten Ones brought me back to serve as their agent in this realm. They needed someone who understood the court. Someone who could move freely among the nobility, and someone who had a personal connection to Prince Kieran." Kieran had gone very still beside her, his face pale with shock. "Morwen. But how? Why?" "Why? Because I learned the truth about what really happened to my family, about who was truly responsible for their destruction. It wasn't the king or his advisors who ordered our deaths, it was her." Morwen's gaze fixed on Renna with burning hatred. "The precious Worldwalker who claims to be our savior. She wrote our tragedy, created our suffering, shaped our destinies according to her whims." "That's not how it works," Renna protested. "I didn't know you were real. I didn't know any of this was real." "Didn't you? Or did you simply choose not to think about the consequences of your imagination? Did you simply assume that the pain you created, the lives you destroyed, didn't matter because they were just fiction?" The accusation hit Renna like a physical blow because there was truth in it. She had created tragic backstories for her characters without fully considering what that meant if they were real people. She had written deaths and betrayals and heartbreak as plot devices, never imagining that somewhere, somehow, real people might be living through those experiences. "Even if that's true," Kieran said, his voice steady despite the obvious pain in his eyes, "it doesn't justify what you're doing now. Revenge won't bring back the dead or undo the past." "Won't it? Won't it?" Morwen's smile grew wider. "That's where you're wrong, my love. The Forgotten Ones had learned to manipulate the barriers between worlds. to reach across the dimensional divide and alter the very foundations of reality. Once they complete their ritual, they'll be able to rewrite history itself, undoing every tragedy, reversing every loss. At what cost? Renna demanded. At the cost of this corrupt, broken world and everyone in it. A small price to pay for true justice. The magical barrier around them was now complete, and Renna felt herself being lifted off the ground by invisible forces. Kieran grabbed her hand, his own power flaring as he tried to break them free, but Morwen's magic was too strong. "Don't worry," Morwen said as they were carried toward the Sunspire Tower. "You'll have a chance to make amends for your crimes. My master is very interested in speaking with you before he completes his work." The tower loomed before them, its black stone surface covered in symbols that seemed to move and shift when viewed directly. As they were carried through the entrance, Renna could feel the magical energies pressing against her like a physical weight. Whatever the Forgotten Ones were doing here, it was powerful enough to tear holes in reality itself. They were brought to a chamber near the top of the tower, where a man in elaborate robes waited for them. He was tall and gaunt, with silver hair and eyes that held the cold light of distant stars. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "Welcome, Worldwalker. I am Archon Valdris, last of the true rulers of this realm, and architect of its restoration." He gestured to the windows, where they could see the city spread out below them. "Behold what your presence has wrought: chaos, destruction, the very foundations of order crumbling into dust." "I didn't cause this," Renna said, though her voice lacked conviction. "The attacks, the magical disruptions, that was your doing. Was it? Or was it the inevitable result of your intrusion into our reality? You came here carrying the power to reshape existence itself, but without the wisdom to understand the consequences of that power." Valdris moved closer, his presence radiating cold that seemed to seep into her bones. "Do you have any idea how many lives had been disrupted? How many destinies have been thrown into chaos, simply because you decided to play with forces beyond your comprehension?" "She didn't choose to come here," Kieran said, stepping protectively in front of Renna. "Whatever brought her to this realm, it wasn't her conscious decision, wasn't it?" Valdris smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "Tell me, Worldwalker, when you wrote your stories, did you never imagine what it would be like to actually live within them? Did you never fantasize about meeting the characters you'd created, about experiencing the love and adventure you described in such vivid detail?" Renna felt her heart sink as she realized the truth of his words. She had fantasized about entering her own stories, had dreamed of meeting Kieran and experiencing the romance she'd written between him and Seraphina. Those fantasies, innocent as they'd seemed, had apparently been enough to tear holes in the barriers between worlds. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Intentions matter little when weighed against consequences. Your desire to experience your own fiction has brought catastrophe to an entire realm." Valdris gestured to a series of crystals arranged around the chamber, each one pulsing with different colored lights. "But perhaps some good can come from this disaster. Your power, properly channeled, could be used to restore what was lost, to undo the damage that has been done." "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about a complete reset, a return to the way things were before the barriers were breached. Your power could be used to seal the dimensional rifts permanently, to restore the separation between fiction and reality." His eyes grew intense. "All you have to do is surrender yourself willingly to the ritual. Allow us to channel your essence through the Nexus crystals, and we can repair the damage your presence has caused." "And what happens to me in this scenario?" "You return to your own world, your own reality. You go back to being a simple writer of fiction, and we return to being the stuff of imagination." Valdris's voice grew persuasive. "Isn't that what you wanted all along? To go home?" Renna looked around the chamber, taking in the magical apparatus that surrounded them, the sense of vast energies being gathered and focused. She thought about her apartment in New York, her quiet life as a romance novelist, the safety and predictability of a world where magic was just something that happened in books. But she also thought about Mira, who had risked her own safety to help them expose the conspiracy. About Queen Isabel, who had shown courage and wisdom in the face of impossible circumstances. About all the people in the city below who were suffering because of forces beyond their control. And she thought about Kieran, whose love for her had grown beyond anything she'd originally written, who had chosen to trust her completely despite knowing the truth about his fictional origins. "There's another option," she said slowly. "Instead of trying to undo what's happened, instead of returning to the way things were, what if we tried to make things better?" "Better?" Valdris's expression grew dangerous. "You think you can improve upon centuries of carefully maintained order?" "I think the old order was based on oppression and fear. I think the magical purges were wrong, and the suppression of entire bloodlines was wrong, and the system that allowed such things to happen was fundamentally flawed." Renna felt power flowing through her as she spoke, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You're so focused on restoring what was lost that you've forgotten to ask whether it was worth restoring in the first place. You know nothing about the old ways, nothing about the wisdom that guided our ancestors. I know that wisdom which requires the oppression of others isn't wisdom at all. I know that power structures built on fear and violence are doomed to collapse eventually." She looked directly into his cold eyes. "And I know that the future doesn't have to be a repetition of the past. Enough." Valdris raised his hand, and magical energy crackled around his fingers. "You will submit to the ritual willingly, or we will extract your essence by force. Either way, this ends today." But before he could strike, the chamber was suddenly filled with new arrivals. Queen Isabel strode through the doorway flanked by royal guards, while behind her came Mira and several other servants who had apparently decided that their loyalty to Renna outweighed their fear of magical powers. "Stand down, Archon," the Queen commanded, her voice carrying absolute authority. "By royal decree, these proceedings are terminated. You have no authority here, mortal Queen. This tower exists beyond the reach of your mundane laws." "Does it?" Queen Isabel smiled, but the expression was sharp as a blade. "Then perhaps you should look more carefully at who stands with me." As she spoke, the servants behind her threw back their hoods, revealing faces that Renna recognized from her novel's minor characters she'd created as background figures. People like Mira who had grown beyond their original roles to become real, independent beings. But now she could see that they all shared something else, the subtle signs of magical heritage that marked them as descendants of the old bloodlines. "The bloodlines were never truly destroyed," the Queen continued. "They went into hiding, yes, but they survived, passed down their gifts through generations of secrecy and careful breeding. And now they stand with the Worldwalker, not against her." "Impossible," Valdris breathed, but Renna could see uncertainty creeping into his cold composure. "Is it? Did you really think you were the only ones who remembered the old ways? The only ones who carried the true power?" One of the servants stepped forward, and Renna recognized him as Marcus, a stable hand she'd mentioned briefly in her novel. But now his eyes blazed with magical fire, and when he spoke, his voice carried the resonance of deep power. "We've been waiting for the Worldwalker's arrival, preparing for this moment when the barriers would weaken enough for real change to become possible. But not change that requires destroying everything that currently exists," added another voice. Renna turned to see Lord Ashworth entering the chamber, apparently having been freed from wherever the Forgotten Ones had been holding him. Change that grows from understanding and cooperation rather than conquest and domination. The chamber was now filled with people, magical and non-magical alike, all standing together in opposition to Valdris and his plans. Renna felt tears pricking her eyes as she realized what she was seeing, the kind of unity and cooperation that she'd always tried to write into her stories, but had never quite managed to capture fully. "This is impossible," Valdris repeated, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "The old bloodlines would never ally themselves with mundane mortals. The hierarchies are too deeply ingrained, the differences too fundamental." "Maybe they were, once," Kieran said quietly. "But things change, people grow, and sometimes old hierarchies need to be questioned." He looked at Renna with an expression of complete trust and devotion. "She taught me that. She showed me that love and partnership are stronger than any power structure based on domination." "Love," Valdris spat. "A mundane emotion. a weakness that clouds judgment and corrupts purpose. Is it? Renna stepped forward, feeling the combined power of everyone in the chamber flowing through her. Or is it the strongest force in any universe, the thing that drives people to sacrifice for each other, to build something better than what came before? As she spoke, she reached out to take Kieran's hand, and immediately felt their connection amplify beyond anything they'd experienced before. But this time, the power didn't stop with them. It flowed outward to encompass everyone in the chamber, creating a network of energy that pulsed with shared purpose and determination. You want to know what real power looks like? She continued, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate from multiple dimensions. It's not the ability to impose your will on others, or to reshape reality according to your personal desires. Real power is the ability to bring people together, to help them see past their differences and work towards something greater than themselves. The nexus crystals around the chamber began to pulse more rapidly, but instead of the cold light they'd emitted under Valdris's control, they now glowed with warm, golden energy that seemed to sing with joy. The ritual, Valdris said desperately, reaching toward the central crystal. I can still complete the ritual, still reset everything. But as his hand touched the crystal, the network of power that connected everyone in the chamber surged through it. Instead of the dimensional reset he'd planned, the crystal began to project something entirely different, images of possible futures, potential outcomes that could flow from this moment. Renna saw glimpses of a kingdom where magical and non-magical people worked together, where the old bloodlines used their gifts to heal rather than dominate, where the barriers between worlds remained intact but permeable enough to allow for growth and change. She saw herself and Kieran ruling not as conquerors but as partners, helping to guide the realm toward a future that honored its past while embracing new possibilities. But she also saw darker possibilities, futures where fear and prejudice triumphed, where the Forgotten Ones succeeded in their quest for dominance, where the very fabric of reality collapsed under the weight of competing powers. The choice is ours, she said, her voice reaching everyone in the chamber and beyond, carried by magical energies to every corner of the kingdom. We can choose fear or hope, division or unity, destruction or creation, but we have to choose together. I choose unity, Queen Isabel said immediately, her voice strong and clear. I choose hope, added Lord Ashworth. I choose love, Kieran said softly, his eyes never leaving Renna's face. One by one, everyone in the chamber added their voice to the chorus, and as they did, the golden energy from the crystals spread outward, flowing through the tower and into the city beyond. Wherever it touched, the chaotic energies that had been tearing at reality began to stabilize. The dimensional rifts began to seal, and the sense of impending catastrophe began to fade. Valdris stood in the center of the chamber, watching his plans crumble around him. But instead of the rage or despair Renna had expected, she saw something that looked almost like relief in his ancient eyes. Perhaps, he said quietly, it is time for the old ways to truly end. And with those words, he stepped forward and placed his own hand on the central crystal, adding his considerable power to the network that was reshaping reality around them. The golden energy flared blindingly bright for a moment, then settled into a steady, warm glow that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the heartbeat of the world itself. When the was beginning to worry. You've been sleeping for nearly 2 days. 2 days? Renna's mind raced as she struggled to make sense of the situation. The woman's accent was unfamiliar yet perfectly comprehensible. As if Renna had grown up hearing it. She looked down at herself and gasped. Her hands, usually ink-stained from endless writing sessions, were now pale and soft, with perfectly manicured nails. Her body felt different, too. Younger, smaller, enclosed in a chemise of fine linen. Where am I? The voice that emerged from her throat wasn't her own. It was higher, more melodious, with that same strange accent. The servant's brow furrowed with concern. You're in your chambers at Ravenshallow, my lady. Don't you remember? You arrived with the diplomatic envoy from Ashworth 3 days ago. Ashworth. The name hit Renna like a physical blow. Lady Seraphina Ashworth, the protagonist of her novel. She scrambled from the bed and rushed to the window. Her legs unsteady, The view that greeted her confirmed her worst fears and wildest impossibilities. Below lay a castle courtyard bustling with activity. Servants in medieval dress hurried about their tasks, and guards in leather armor patrolled the walls. In the distance, she could see the city of Valdres spreading out like a living map, its towers and spires exactly as she'd described them in her manuscript. The twin moons hung in the afternoon sky, their pale light visible even in décolleté details she'd included to make her fantasy world feel more otherworldly. "This is impossible," she whispered, pressing her palms against the cool stone of the window frame. "This is absolutely impossible. My lady?" The servant had approached quietly, her face etched with worry. "Perhaps you should lie down again. The journey was long, and you've been unwell." Renna turned to face her, mind spinning. If she was truly in her own novel, then this servant would be, "You're Mira, aren't you?" The young woman smiled. "Yes, my lady. I'm pleased you remember me. I was afraid the fever had affected your memory." Mira, Seraphina's loyal maid, who'd been with her since childhood. A minor character Renna had created to provide exposition and emotional support for her protagonist. Yet here she stood, as real as anyone, with genuine concern shining in her brown eyes. "Mira, I need to ask you something." Renna's voice came out steadier than she felt. "The Prince Kieran. Where is he?" "His Highness is preparing for the evening's festivities, my lady. The welcome banquet is tonight, and all the noble houses will be in attendance." Mira's expression grew cautious. "Though I must warn you, my lady, the prince has been particularly intense since your arrival. The servants whisper that he watches your windows at night." A chill ran down Renna's spine. In her novel, Kieran's obsession with Seraphina had been romantic, driven by a twisted form of love, but she'd written him as a dangerous man, capable of terrible things when crossed. The realization that she was now trapped in a world with a character she'd designed to be both irresistible and potentially lethal made her stomach clench with fear. "What time is the banquet?" she asked, forcing herself to think practically. If she was truly in her own story, then she knew the plot at least. She knew how she'd written it. But something felt different already. The Seraphina in her novel hadn't been confused about her identity or unsure of her purpose. She'd been brave, decisive, and ultimately willing to sacrifice everything for love. "At sunset, my lady. Shall I prepare your gown?" Renna nodded, though every instinct screamed at her to run. But where could she go? This world, as far as she knew, extended only as far as her imagination had taken it. She'd focused primarily on the castle and the immediate political situation, giving only vague details about the broader kingdom. For all she knew, the world simply ended at the borders of her narrative. As Mira bustled about the room, selecting a gown of deep emerald silk, Renna tried to remember every detail of her plot. The welcome banquet was where Seraphina first encountered Prince Kieran, where their dance together would scandalize the court and begin the complex web of attraction and manipulation that drove the story forward. In her novel, it had been a scene of electric tension and barely contained desire. Renna wasn't Seraphina. No matter what body she now inhabited, she was a 30-year-old woman from modern-day New York who'd written romance novels to pay the bills. She had no idea how to navigate medieval politics or survive in a world where women had few rights and fewer options. "My lady, if I may be so bold," Mira said as she laid out the gown, "you seem different since your arrival. Are you quite well?" The question hung in the air between them, and Renna realized she had to make a choice. She could try to explain the impossible truth, or she could attempt to play the role of Seraphina Ashworth, diplomat's daughter and unwitting pawn in a game of royal vengeance. "I'm still recovering from the journey," she said finally. "Everything feels strange and new." Mira's expression softened. "Perhaps that's for the best, my lady. A fresh start in a new place can be a blessing. Though I confess, I worry about your safety here. The prince's reputation precedes him." "What do you know about him?" "Only what the servants whisper. They say he's never forgiven the court for his family's disgrace, that he's been planning his revenge for years." Some say he's half mad with grief and rage. Others claim he's merely cold and calculating. Mira's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But they all agree on one thing: he's dangerous. Renna felt a mixture of pride and terror at how well her character had translated to this reality. She'd worked hard to make Kieran complex. A man driven by legitimate grievances but twisted by his pursuit of vengeance. In her novel, love had been his redemption. But she was beginning to realize that real life, even fictional real life, might not pass a fall of a neat arc she'd plotted. Has he hurt anyone? Not directly, my lady. But his enemies have a way of finding themselves ruined or exiled. The prince fights with politics and influence rather than swords, which makes him all the more dangerous. Mira began unlacing Renna's simple chemise. Now, let's get you dressed. The prince may be dangerous, but he's also the key to your father's diplomatic mission. You must be at your best tonight. As Mira helped her into the elaborate gown, Renna tried to remember what she'd written about Lord Ashworth's diplomatic mission. Something about trade agreements and border disputes. The kind of political maneuvering that provided a convenient excuse for Seraphina to be at court. But the details felt fuzzy, like trying to remember a dream upon waking. The emerald silk felt heavy against Peen. Her skin, its bodice tight and restrictive. The sleeves were long and fitted, and the skirt flowed out in elegant folds that would make dancing both graceful and treacherous. Mira arranged her hair in an elaborate style, weaving small pearls through the dark strands. When she finally looked in the mirror, a stranger stared back at her. Seraphina Ashworth was beautiful in a way that Renna had never been. Her features were more delicate. Her eyes a startling shade of violet that seemed to shift with the light. Her skin was pale and unmarked by the stress lines that had begun to appear around Renna's eyes. She looked like a romantic heroine, which, she supposed, now was. You look magnificent, my lady, Mira said with genuine pride. The prince will be unable to look away. That was exactly what Renna was afraid of. In her novel, Kieran's immediate attraction to Seraphina had been based on her resemblance to his lost love, a woman who died during his family's downfall, but also on Seraphina's strength and intelligence, qualities that had intrigued him even as he plotted to use her for his revenge. Mira, tell me about the other nobles who will be at the banquet tonight. I want to be prepared. As Mira recounted the various lords and ladies, their family histories and political alignments, Renna realized with growing unease that she recognized very few of the names. She'd created perhaps a dozen noble characters for her novel, focusing on those directly involved in the main plot. But Mira spoke of dozens of families, each with their own complex relationships and historical grievances. The world she'd created was apparently far more detailed and populated than she'd ever imagined. Either her subconscious had been working overtime, or stepping into this reality had somehow filled in the gaps in her world building. The implications were staggering and terrifying. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mira opened it to reveal a young page in the royal bod livery, his face flushed with excitement or fear. Lady Seraphina, he said with a bow. His Highness Prince Kieran requests your presence in the garden before the banquet begins. He wishes to speak with you privately. Renna's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't part of her plot. In her novel, the first meeting between Seraphina and Kieran had taken place at the banquet itself. A public encounter that had set tongues wagging throughout the court. A private meeting in the garden suggested something far more intimate and potentially dangerous. Tell His Highness that I'll be along shortly, she managed to say, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. The page bowed again and departed, leaving Renna alone with Mira and her churning thoughts. This was it, the moment where she would come face to face with the character she created. The man she'd written to be both irresistible and ruthless. She had no idea how closely this real version would match her fictional creation, or whether her knowledge of his character would be an advantage or a liability. My lady, are you certain about this? Mira's voice was tight with worry. It's highly irregular for a prince to request a private meeting with an unmarried lady. Your reputation will survive, Renna finished, though she wasn't sure she believed it. In her novel, Reputation and social standing had been crucial elements of the political game. One wrong move could destroy a woman's prospects entirely. But she also knew that refusing Prince Kieran's request would be equally dangerous. If he truly was as she'd written him, he wouldn't tolerate being dismissed or ignored. Her best chance of survival lay in playing along with his game, at least until she could figure out a way home. "Help me with my cloak," she said, reaching for the heavy velvet garment that would protect her from the evening chill. "And Mira? If I'm not back within the hour, send word to my father." The garden was bathed in the soft light of the twin moons, their silver radiance turning the autumn flowers into ghostly shadows. Renna made her way along the winding path, her heart pounding with each step. The sound of her shoes on the gravel seemed impossibly loud in the quiet evening air. She found him waiting by the fountain at the garden's center, a tall figure in black velvet who stood with his back to her. Even from behind, she recognized the broad shoulders and dark hair that she'd described in countless pages. When he turned at the sound of her approach, she felt her breath catch in her throat. Prince Kieran Blackthorne was exactly as she'd imagined him, yet somehow more real than any character had a right to be. His silver eyes caught the moonlight, and his face was a study in aristocratic perfection marred by a subtle cruelty around the mouth. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often were, compelling and terrifying in equal measure. "Lady Seraphina," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers down her spine. "You look radiant tonight." "Your Highness." She executed what she hoped was a proper curtsy, grateful for the countless period dramas she'd watched for research. "You wish to speak with me?" "Indeed." He moved closer, and she caught the scent of sandalwood and something darker, more primal. "I wanted to welcome you to Ravenshallow personally. Your reputation precedes you." "My reputation?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. She'd written Seraphina as relatively unknown at court, her value lying in her father's diplomatic connections rather than any personal accomplishments. Kieran's smile was sharp as a blade. "Surely you're not so modest, my lady. Word of your unique talents has reached even these remote halls." Renna's blood ran cold. This was wrong, all wrong. She'd never written anything about Seraphina having unique talents. Her protagonist had been clever and brave, but hardly extraordinary. Yet something in Kieran's tone suggested he knew things about her that she didn't even know about herself. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Your Highness." "Don't you?" He circled her slowly, like a predator assessing prey. "Perhaps you're right to be cautious. These gardens have ears, and words spoken in moonlight have a way of reaching the wrong listeners." She stood frozen as he completed his circuit, coming to rest directly in front of her. Up close, she could see the flecks of ice blue in his silver eyes, the faint scar that ran along his left temporal detail she'd included to make him seem more dangerous, more real. The irony wasn't lost on her. "I have a proposition for you, Lady Seraphina," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "A game, if you will. I suspect you're not quite who you appear to be, and I find myself intrigued. I'm exactly who I appear to be, Your Highness. Nothing more, nothing less. Are you?" His hand rose to cup her cheek, and she fought the urge to flinch away from his touch. His skin was cold, she realized, unnaturally so. "Then why do you smell of another world?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She stared at him in shock, her mind racing. How could he possibly know? She'd been careful to give no sign of her true identity, to play the role of Seraphina as best she could. I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, the touch both gentle and threatening. "You smell of metal and glass, of a world without magic. You move like someone unused to heavy skirts and soft ground. And your eyes." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Your eyes hold knowledge of things that haven't happened yet." Renna's heart hammered against her ribs as she processed his words. Not only did he somehow know she didn't belong here, but he seemed to understand far more about her situation than should be possible. In her novel, Kieran had been intelligent and perceptive, but she'd never written him as having supernatural abilities. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. The truth, to start with. He stepped back, giving her space to breathe. And then, we'll see how interesting you truly are. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. Kieran's expression shifted instantly, becoming the mask of cold courtesy that she'd written for his public persona. My lords, he said smoothly as two men emerged from the shadows of the garden path. How good of you to join us. Renna recognized them immediately, Lord Matthias Voss and Duke Aldrich Thornfield, two of the most powerful nobles at court and key antagonists in her novel. Voss was thin and sharp-featured, with dark hair and calculating eyes. Thornfield was broader, with graying temples and the bearing of a man accustomed to command. Your Highness, Voss said with a bow that managed to convey both respect and subtle mockery. We were looking for you. The king grows impatient for the banquet to begin. Of course he does. Kieran's smile was coldly amused. Tell His Majesty that I'll be along shortly. I was just getting acquainted with our lovely guest. Thornfield's gaze swept over Renna with undisguised appraisal. Lady Seraphina, isn't it? Lord Ashworth's daughter. I knew your father when he was younger, brilliant negotiator, though perhaps too idealistic for his own good. My father is a man of principle, Renna replied, drawing on every diplomatic instinct she'd written into her character. He believes that honest dealing serves all parties better than deception. How refreshing, Voss murmured, though his tone suggested he found her father's principles more amusing than admirable. I'm sure such idealism will serve you well at court. The subtle threat in his words wasn't lost on her. In her novel, both Voss and Thornfield had been part of the conspiracy that had destroyed Kieran's family, and they remained powerful enemies of anyone who challenged their authority. She'd written them as sophisticated villains, the kind who preferred to destroy their enemies through political maneuvering rather than direct violence. Come, Lady Seraphina, Kieran said, offering her his arm. Allow me to escort you to the banquet. I'm sure the court is eager to meet you. She had little choice but to accept his arm, though his touch sent uncomfortable shivers through her. As they walked back toward the castle, she was acutely aware of Voss and Thornfield following behind them, their conversation too low for her to overhear. The great hall was ablaze with light, hundreds of candles casting dancing shadows across the stone walls. Long tables groaned under the weight of elaborate dishes, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine. Nobles in their finest attire filled the space, their conversations creating a buzz of excitement and intrigue. At the head of the hall sat the high table, where King Aldwin held court. Renna's heart sank as she saw him in her novel. She'd written him as a weak ruler, easily manipulated by his advisors and increasingly paranoid about threats to his throne. But the man she saw now looked far more formidable than her fictional creation, his eyes sharp and calculating as they swept the room. Lady Seraphina, Kieran murmured as they approached the high table. A word of advice. His Majesty has been unwell lately. His moods are unpredictable, and he sees threats where none exist. Be careful not to say anything that might be interpreted as criticism of his rule. Thank you for the warning. She replied, though she wondered why he was helping her. In her novel, Kieran had initially viewed Seraphina as a useful tool in his plans for revenge. His protectiveness now seemed to run deeper than mere pragmatism, the king's attention fixed on them as they approached, and Renna felt the weight of his scrutiny like a physical presence. She executed her best curtsy as Kieran presented her to the court. Your Majesty, Kieran said with a bow that was precisely calculated to show respect without subservience. May I present Lady Seraphina Ashworth, daughter of Lord Edmund Ashworth, your envoy from the Eastern provinces. Ah, yes, the king said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall. Lord Ashworth's daughter. I trust your journey was pleasant? Very much so, Your Majesty, Renna replied, keeping her voice steady. Your kingdom is even more beautiful than I'd been led to believe. Indeed. The king's smile didn't reach his eyes. And what do you make of our court, Lady Seraphina? Are we as civilized as your father expected? The question was clearly a trap, designed to elicit either false flattery or inadvertent insult. Renna drew on her years of writing political intrigue, crafting her response carefully. Your Majesty's court is renowned for its sophistication and learning. My father spoke often of the wisdom of your counselors and the loyalty of your subjects. Loyalty, the king repeated, his gaze shifting to Kieran. Yes, that is a precious commodity, isn't it, nephew? The tension in the hall was palpable as the king's words hung in the air. Renna realized with growing unease that the political situation was far more volatile than she'd written it. In her novel, the conflict between Kieran and the king had been a slow burn, building over time through careful manipulation and strategic moves, but the hostility between them now was barely concealed, threatening to explode at any moment. Indeed, Your Majesty, Kieran replied smoothly. Loyalty must be earned through just rule and fair treatment. I'm sure Lady Seraphina would agree. The king's eyes narrowed at the subtle challenge, but before he could respond, Queen Isabel intervened. Come now, Your Majesty. Surely we can save such serious discussions for the council chamber. Tonight is for celebration and welcome. The queen was another character Renna had written as relatively minor, a gentlewoman caught between her husband's paranoia and her stepson's thirst for revenge. But the woman who spoke now had steel in her voice, and her intervention had the effect of diffusing the tension without appearing to take sides. Of course, my dear, the king said, though his tone suggested the matter was far from settled. Lady Seraphina, you must tell us about your homeland. I hear the eastern provinces are quite prosperous these days. For the next hour, Renna found herself the center of attention as nobles peppered her with questions about her fictional past. She drew on every detail she'd written about Seraphina's background, embellishing where necessary and deflecting when the questions grew too specific. All the while, she was acutely aware of Kieran's presence beside her, his silver eyes watching her every reaction. When the formal presentations were finished and the dancing began, Kieran claimed her hand for the first dance. The other couples gave them a wide berth. Whether out of respect for the prince or fear of association with him, she couldn't tell. You handled that well, he murmured as they moved through the steps of the courtly dance. Most visitors to court are either too eager to please or too proud to bend. You struck the perfect balance. Thank you, Your Highness. She concentrated on the steps, grateful for the dance lessons she'd taken years ago for a friend's Renaissance wedding. Though I have to ask, what exactly did you mean earlier about my scent? About another world? His hand tightened on hers, and for a moment his composure slipped. You truly don't know, do you? You have no idea what you are. When I am? She nearly missed a step, her heart racing. I'm a diplomat's daughter, nothing more. Are you? He spun her gracefully, his voice dropping to a whisper. Then how do you explain the fact that you appeared in my dreams long before you arrived at court? How do you explain the way magic responds to your presence? Magic. The word sent ice through her veins. In her novel, magic had been a subtle force, manifesting primarily through bloodline abilities and ancient artifacts. She'd never written Seraphina as having any magical gifts, but she was beginning to realize that her fictional world had taken on a life of its own. I don't understand, she said, and for once it was the complete truth. Don't you feel it? His voice was urgent now, almost desperate. The way the air changes when you're afraid? The way candles flicker when you're angry? You're not just Seraphina Ashworth, daughter of a minor lord. You're something far more dangerous. The dance ended, but Kieran didn't release her hand. Instead, he led her from the floor toward a quiet alcove where they could speak without being overheard. The other nobles watched their retreat with barely concealed crash. Speculation? And Renna knew that her reputation would be thoroughly dissected by morning. Your Highness, I think there's been some mistake. No mistake. He turned to face her, his silver eyes blazing with an intensity that made her breath catch. You're the one from the prophecy. The one who will either save this kingdom or destroy it utterly. Prophecy. The word hit her like a blow to the chest. She'd never written any prophecy into her novel, never created any mystical element that would make Seraphina crucial to the kingdom's fate. Yet Kieran spoke with absolute certainty, as if he'd been waiting for her arrival his entire life. What prophecy? She managed to ask, though she dreaded the answer. The prophecy of the Worldwalker, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It speaks of one who will come from beyond the veil of reality, who will possess the power to reshape the very fabric of existence. The prophecy says she will arrive in the body of another, carrying knowledge of things that have yet to come to pass. Renna's legs nearly gave out beneath her. This was impossible. She'd created this world, written every detail of its history and politics. There had been no prophecy, no mystical elements beyond the basic magical bloodlines she'd invented, yet Kieran spoke as if these were established facts, as if her arrival had been foretold centuries ago. That's not possible, she whispered. Isn't it? He stepped closer, his hand reaching up to touch her face. You arrived 3 days ago, yet you move like someone who's never worn a corset. You speak our language perfectly, yet your accent carries traces of something foreign. And tonight, when you were angry with the king, every candle in the hall flickered at the same moment. She looked back toward the great hall, where the celebration continued unabated. The candles burned steadily now, their light warm and golden. But as she watched, one of them suddenly flared brighter, as if responding to Bassin, her attention. This is insane, she breathed. None of this is real. I'm dreaming, or I'm having some sort of breakdown, or you're exactly where you're meant to be. His voice was gentle now, almost tender. I've been waiting for you, Seraphina. Waiting for someone who could help me save this kingdom from the corruption that's poisoning it. I can't save anyone, she said desperately. I'm just a writer. I make up stories about people who don't exist and places that aren't real. And yet, here you are, in a place you claim isn't real, speaking to someone who doesn't exist. His smile was sad and knowing. Perhaps it's time to consider that your stories were never fiction at all. The implications of his words were staggering. If her novels weren't fiction, if she'd somehow been writing about real places and real people, then every book she'd published was a detailed account of actual events. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. If that's true, she said slowly, then I know how this story ends. I know what happens to everyone. Do you? His expression grew serious. Or do you only know what you wrote? Because I can tell you now, Lady Seraphina, that the story has already begun to change. The future you think you know may not be the future that comes to pass. As if to emphasize his point, a commotion erupted in the great hall. Shouts and the sound of running feet echoed through the stone corridors, and several guards burst through the doors with weapons drawn. Your Majesty, one of them called out, his face flushed with exertion. We've had reports of an attack on the eastern border. Lord Ashworth's estates are under siege. The hall fell silent as the news sank in. Renna felt the blood drain from her face as she realized the implications. In her novel, Lord Ashworth had been a minor character, important only as Seraphina's father, and the excuse for her presence at court. She'd never written anything about his estates being attacked, or his life being in danger. But if the story was changing, if events were unfolding differently than she'd planned, then her knowledge of the plot was useless. Worse, it might be actively dangerous if she acted on assumptions that were no longer true. Who dares attack my lands? The king demanded, his voice booming across the hall. What force would be bold enough to assault a royal envoy? The reports are unclear, Your Majesty, the guard replied. But there are signs of magical involvement. The attackers seem to be using powers that our forces can't counter. Magic. Again, the word that seemed to follow her everywhere in this world. Renna looked at Kieran, who was watching her with an expression of grim satisfaction. It begins, he murmured, so quietly that only she could hear. The forces that seek to control the kingdom have made their move. They know you're here, and they know what you represent. What I represent? She was growing tired of speaking in riddles, tired of having crucial information withheld from her. I don't represent anything. I'm just a woman who woke up in the wrong place. You represent change, he said simply. The possibility of a different future. and there are those who would kill to prevent that future from coming to pass. The king was issuing orders now, mobilizing troops and sending messengers to gather more information about the attack. The festive atmosphere of the banquet had evaporated, replaced by tension and fear. Nobles clustered in small groups, their conversations urgent and worried. Lady Seraphina, Queen Isabel, appeared at her elbow, her face pale but composed. "I'm so sorry to hear about your father. We must pray that he and his people are safe." "Thank you, Your Majesty." Renna replied automatically, though her mind was racing. If Lord Ashworth was truly under attack, then she was stranded at court with no allies and no way home. Her fictional father had been her only connection to safety, her only excuse for being at Ravenshallow. "You'll stay here, of course," the Queen continued. "It would be far too dangerous for you to attempt to return home while the situation is so uncertain." "I appreciate your hospitality, Your Majesty, but I should try to help my father." "Absolutely not." The king's voice cut across her protest. "I won't have it said that I allowed a guest to ride into danger. You'll remain at court until we can determine the extent of the threat." There was no room for argument in his tone, and Renna realized with growing alarm that she was essentially a prisoner. In her novel, Seraphina had stayed at court by choice, drawn by her attraction to Kieran and her desire to help him achieve his goals. But this Seraphina was trapped, her movements controlled by a king who saw her as both a valuable diplomatic asset and a potential security risk. "Come," Kieran said quietly, taking her arm. "Let me escort you back to your chambers. You've had enough excitement for one evening." As they made their way through the corridors, Renna's mind churned with questions and fears. The attack on her father's estates, the prophecy Kieran had mentioned. The strange magical abilities she apparently possessed, none of it made sense. Her carefully crafted novel had become something chaotic and unpredictable, and she had no idea how to navigate the changes. "How much of what you told me is true?" she asked as they reached her chambers. "All of it," he replied simply. "The prophecy, the magic, the danger you're in, it's all real. The question is, what are you going to do about it?"